And a congressional reporter for the Washington Post. Okay, Ed, so the president stopped short of completely bailing out of this deal. What's the strategy here? Why is he kicking it to Congress on that part?
Because he wants to see if he can build up bipartisan support to push for these changes that he called for there, especially things like the way that this agreement would sunset or end over the course of several years. Also pushing to see whether there's bipartisan support to go after Iran's support of extremist or terrorist groups in Yemen, Lebanon, and elsewhere. There is, this of course is a compromise between outright pulling out of the deal, which many of the president's national security advisors, including the defense secretary and the secretary of state, were opposed to doing right away, and lawmakers who understand the risk of doing so. And so that's why we're going to see now Republicans, led especially by Bob Corker of Tennessee and Tom Cotton of Arkansas, try to craft some kind of bipartisan agreement that would allow the U.S. to pursue these changes to the deal. But short term, the president there certainly making some news by saying that the United States will more severely sanction the Iranian Revolutionary Guard.
I think we may have lost our Ed O'Keefe there, but I want to turn now to Tehran, where our own Elizabeth Palmer is on the ground in Tehran. Elizabeth, many people might not know, but part of this deal with Iran, there were spare parts for airplanes. The airplane aviation industry isn't doing so well in Iran. What are some other aspects of the deal? Where do you think the Iranians will feel this the most?
Well, the main thing that Iran wanted from the deal was a great big tsunami of foreign investment to create jobs for a huge, well-educated, young workforce. And although technically European banks are now allowed to deal with Iran when the sanctions were lifted, they're not doing it because they're very afraid that U.S. Treasury is going to come after them with big fines. The U.S. still has sanctions in place against Iran, and it kind of sits in the background with a big cudgel saying to the banks, if you do business we don't like with Iran, we're coming after you. So although the sanctions were lifted, the foreign investment didn't come flooding in, neither from the U.S. nor from Europe, and it's really put a damper on the economy. Iranian young people who don't like the regime say, look, you can't get rid of the Revolutionary Guard and the more radical elements of the regime by beating them up, by trying to frighten them, by sanctioning them to bits. You have to, the very best way would be through economic development. Get us some money and give it to us, and the explosion of enthusiasm and business and foreign influence will do the job. But of course they feel tonight that they've just seen that possibility melt away, and they're very depressed.
Liz, you know, part of this deal was also negotiated with 5 other countries. The U.S. had worked in tandem when it came to sanctions with these countries. Is there a sense that if the U.S. were to implement sanctions, and let's say that other European countries decide not to go along with that, do the Iranians feel that the Europeans might continue to back them and not go along with sanctions that the U.S. chooses to implement?
Almost certainly, but as I explained to you, it might not make a difference. You know, it's all very well to say we're not going to respect American sanctions, but if you behave as you're respecting them because you're so afraid of the U.S. Treasury doling out big fines, then it amounts to the same thing. Politically, there will be solidarity with Iran from the Europeans, certainly from Russia and from China. And that means a lot to Iran. That may be enough to keep them in the deal and let the United States come up with some approach that it's happy with. And then all of the 5 other members in Iran will reconsider the U.S. position. But equally, there is a threat that Iran can go, you know what, we're out. That's it. And people who regard the deal as having been far from perfect, but nevertheless kept Iran bound to a series of inspections and international oversight, will be very disturbed. In fact, the Russian foreign minister said tonight that this is a real setback for non-proliferation in the world.
You talk about the setback for non-proliferation. What does it mean for our allies in the UK, France, Germany, who also worked hard to negotiate this deal?
They will be disappointed. They will undoubtedly, many of them agree with Iran's President Rouhani, who will say, you know what, the United States is not abiding by its agreement. It is not to be trusted. The Trump administration particularly is not to be trusted. It's not an administration we care to do business with. And some senior diplomats that I've spoken to are particularly concerned that North Korea will be watching this. And so assuming we could ever get North Korea to agree to some sort of non-proliferation deal, North Korea might be saying to itself right now, why would we sign anything with the United States? You know, several years down the line, they'll probably just move the goalposts. So there's the diplomatic world is alive with all kinds of chatter tonight, and it's only over the next days and even weeks that we'll see how the Europeans, the Chinese, and the Russian position themselves to contain the fallout.
Our Elizabeth Palmer on the ground there. Elizabeth, we're going to be checking back with you. We know that we are expecting a statement from the Iranian government shortly. We look forward to hearing what they have to say. I want to turn to Ed O'Keefe, who joins us now as well. Ed, I was taken back by something the president said. He said, I want to go back and instruct intelligence agencies to do a thorough analysis of Iran's behavior and compliance, which is part of this deal. Every 3 months you go back and you see whether they're complying and if it's in the U.S. interest. But doesn't that potentially leave the door to politicizing U.S. intelligence?
Yeah, absolutely. And it sounds also there that he doesn't like what he's heard from the intelligence agencies so far and is hoping they come up with something else that might justify what he's doing here. But to Liz's point about the diplomatic concern around the world, I think that is exactly why we now see the agreement that the president has laid out here and the hope that Congress can work with the White House on some new negotiating terms. Clearly, in his speech there, the president making clear he didn't like this. It runs counter to everything he has been as a negotiator and as a businessman who cuts deals. He just didn't like the idea of this on principle, but he clearly has been convinced to keep at it and see whether Congress can come up with some new ideas. And I think the fact that we've seen the Foreign Relations Committee Chairman Bob Corker so involved here in trying to convince the president to get to this new arrangement signals that Corker and other lawmakers have been hearing from those diplomats that Liz talks to on the other side of the world about the concerns of what it would mean for the U.S. to so abruptly withdraw. And as I was saying before, somebody forgot to pay the phone bill earlier, the fact that he is implementing tougher sanctions on the Iranian Revolutionary Guard gets him a short-term win, gets him something that he can demonstrate that he's done. But as some experts have already pointed out just here in the last few minutes since he made this announcement, that's a group that's already pretty severely sanctioned. And there's also the threat that that the IRGC will come, as it has before, face-to-face with U.S. military personnel in Iraq and in Syria. I spent a brief time in Iraq back in 2011 and remember that U.S. commanders there in Baghdad were always concerned about the growing influence of the IRGC in Iraq itself. Since then, of course, in Syria. And so there's a potential that this decision tonight or today could actually cause ramifications on the battlefields of Iraq and Syria in the coming weeks as well. Another reason why many are concerned about what the administration is doing here. Mm-hmm.
Talk to me a little bit more, Ed, about the legislation that Corker is trying to put forward with Cotton as well.
Well, it's essentially, you know, the White House is trying to get them to, you know, push for changes to the agreement that would sort of punish Iran for the fact that it supports extremist groups in Yemen and in Lebanon. The other thing that a lot of Republicans especially are concerned about is the time lapse, the fact that after 8 years, after 15 years, things start to ease off, and it essentially would allow Iran to potentially build up its nuclear program again to the point where maybe it is indeed developing weapons. That was also a concern of many Democrats. Bob Menendez, who was for a while the ranking Democrat on the Foreign Relations Committee. Senate Minority Leader Schumer has raised concerns about this. He is, of course, a very pro-Israel lawmaker, so that's part of the reason why he's always been concerned about talks with Iran. But Republicans believe there could be sufficient Democratic support, at least in the Senate, to put together some kind of an agreement. But as I was saying before the president's speech, one of the other issues here is the White House continues to send these complex policy issues back to Congress saying, you sort it out. Whether it's this, whether it's tax reform, whether it's the health care mess, whether it's the decision on immigration. And there are so many plates spinning right now in the House and the Senate where leaders are saying it would be helpful to get some guidance and some specificity from the president on these, that it's going to be really difficult, I think, for Democrats and Republicans, for House lawmakers and senators to put together some kind of agreement and know that it will have the support of the president ultimately should they come up with something.
All right, Ed O'Keefe, thank you very much for joining us, Ed.